Welcome, everybody. This is our second session of our grant writing workshop. We're going to be talking about NIH grants today. The title is Navigating NIH Grants, Funding Pathways for Early Career Professionals. Um, First, we're going to thank our faculty participants here who are going to be participating in our Q&A after a brief didactic session. So Dr. Outtz Reed is from Cornell. Her lab focuses on lymphatic vasculature and lung biology and disease, and has had F, K, and R grants as a principal investigator, and is here to share some of her expertise. Dr. Jarrod Barnes is our second participant from University of Alabama at Birmingham, UAB. His lab focuses on metabolism and glycosylation in idiopathic pulmonary arterial hypertension. He has held a F-32, a K99R00, and an R01, and also here to give a different approach on grants that can get you to your first independent R01. And then finally, we have Dr. Rachel Knipe, who's an assistant professor at Mass General. Her lab focuses on endothelial injury and endothelial dysfunction that contributes to the development of lung disease, particularly pulmonary fibrosis. And Dr. Knipe has had a KO8, an RO3, and an RO1. So a variety of backgrounds and a variety of kind of pathways through NIH funding mechanisms. This is put on by the RCMB ECP working group. And so I'm Joe Bednash. I'm from Ohio State. Dr. Chow He is currently at Baylor and will also be moderating the discussion today. And then Dr. Jennifer Larson-Casey is at UAB as the co-chair of our grant writing committee for the year. And then special thanks to Tiana Lino, who provides all of our technical support and logistic expertise here. As I said, this is part 2 of a 4-part series on grant writing. There's 2 more that we have coming up. The third is using foundation grants to support your early career. We'll talk about a couple of ways to find foundation grants and you know which ones might be appropriate for you. It's the last Thursday in March, the 27th at 3. And then session 4 will be mock study section the last Thursday of April, the 24th. If you want to find these or any other similar events on the ATS website, if you hover on About Us, you can slide down to Calendar, and all the upcoming events are there. You'll also get emails about them, but if you don't always thoroughly read that email, as some of us don't, you can find all this information there. All right, so plan for today, talking about NIH grants. We'll begin with just a brief didactic about kind of navigating the NIH and funding opportunities for early career professionals, and then go into the highlight of the event today, which is the Q&A with our faculty experts. We'll split that up into a couple different sections. So we'll start talking about kind of fellowship and training grants, F&T mechanisms, transition to K awards, and then finally how to get that first RO1 and any bridge awards you can use or NIH mechanisms to help you on the way. So just a couple disclosures before we get going. The materials that we have in the slides today are all publicly available on nih.gov. You'll see that there's a lot of links in all the slides, and they'll be distributed after the event. So you don't have to write down the web addresses or anything like that. They'll be available in the PowerPoint. And then also, as many of you know, there's some things going on at the NIH right now. So we had asked some NIH program officers to be a part of this session. That's how it was initially advertised. Unfortunately, they're not able to join us today, but are still supportive of all of our careers, and specifically said, especially the NHLBI PIs, that if anybody has any further questions or wants to reach out to them, they're available via email. You can find all those on the NIH website, and I'll show you another way to get it too. All right, so I'll be presenting the didactic today, and then we'll get into our Q&A. So just some basics on the NIH. The NIH is organized into 27 institutes and centers, or ICs. I have all the abbreviations, the alphabet soup, shown there on the right side of the screen. 19 of these ICs are categorical, meaning things like heart, lung, blood, NHLBI that we're all aware of, cancer, NCI, infectious diseases, etc. And then 5 are not categorical, things like National Institute of General Medicine and NCATS, which is for translational science. 80 to 85% of the annual NIH budget funds extramural projects right now, with the remainder going for people located physically at the NIH and for internal NIH projects. This is just a schematic showing those 27 ICs and the 24 of which that have funding authority. So underneath the Office of the Director, we have all of our various institutes, this time spelled out as opposed to the alphabet soup. And on the bottom, a few that support multiple institutes, such as the Clinical Center, the Center for Information Technology, and the Center for Scientific Review. So how do we navigate all these things? How do we find the right place to go? I have a couple tools here that people can use to find not only appropriate institutes or centers for you, but also grants or mechanisms that may be appropriate. So this is just a summary. We'll talk about a couple of these. The NIH Matchmaker, there's a guide for funding announcements. Each institute and center has a strategic vision that'll detail what they're interested in. You can always talk to your program officer, and that link kind of suggests what are good questions for the program officer, which we'll talk about later. And then, of course, you can talk to any mentors or colleagues or people at your university to find out where do they get grants and what's appropriate for me at this point in my career. NIH Matchmaker is the first tool that I had mentioned. It's available through NIH Reporter. NIH Reporter is a fun way to look up, different funding mechanisms, look to see who's had what grants if you have any questions about a specific mechanism. And then the Matchmaker tool is on the bottom of the homepage, and you can just type in any kind of text to find other grants, which institutes or centers or which program officer may be appropriate for you. So as an example here, I typed in role of macrophages in acute lung injury, something I'm interested in. And under the projects, you can see which centers or institutes fund a project such like that. Not surprisingly, NHLBI is the most common to fund such a project. And then you can see the different activity codes or which study section it went to for review. The other tab on there is program officials, and this is actually a good way to come up to find a PO or someone you may be interested in if you're trying to see if your grant is appropriate for a specific institute or if a PO can give you some feedback. It'll give you a list of the program officers there. You'll see kind of in the middle on the bottom part there, it says view email. If you click on that, it just shows you their email. I didn't put them on here, but they're not actually, they're just one click away. They're not truly hidden or behind any kind of paywall or other kind of security. So the second tool I mentioned was the NIH guide to search for active funding opportunities. So here you can search by institute or center. You can search by funding categories. You can search by keywords and the title. You can pick specific mechanisms, R01, K08, etc., and just see what's currently being offered. This is a comprehensive list of everything that's available to apply for at the time. It's pretty cumbersome. You can see that for a lot of the parent awards or the more common mechanisms that many of the ICs participate in each of these, and I left the link there at the bottom if anybody wants to search around. The other resource is each institute or center strategic vision. They normally have some overarching goals. I think they list 8 objectives on the strategic vision for NHLBI. And underneath each of these, there's a whole bunch more for a total of, I think, 130 some goals and objectives as part of the strategic vision of the NHLBI. This is just kind of interesting to see how, what kind of approaches and what kind of slant each institute or center likes to focus on in their science. And the other thing I mentioned was talking to the program officer. So program officers are here to help you. This is right from the NIH website as far as staff roles at each institute and center. So there's a section on when to contact your PO. So you can see help identify an appropriate type of grant program or funding opportunity that may be appropriate for your research and your stage of your career. You can get some feedback on your specific aims if they fit into the mission and scope of that center or institute. And then after your grant application, you can also get feedback on the comments from study section or what aspects of a review you may focus on to get your grant funded on resubmission, things like that. And then They also mentioned on the website, and anybody's ever contacted a PO, it's good to do your homework first. There's a lot of information available online. They're busy, so you want to make a good impression when you email them. So having a specific question formulated and already having looked up any of the answers that you could have before you reached out is also just a good courtesy and a good way to go about that. So I left the link there also on IC staff roles. There's a more comprehensive guide of when to contact, what you can ask them, what they can't help you with, and then some tips for making those communications go smoothly. So we'll transition into kind of what we want to do for a lot of our Q&A. We did I just wanted to have an intro as far as the plethora of grants that are offered through the NIH and get everybody some resources through this PowerPoint so that you can explore these parts of the website yourself. This is an infographic from the NIH website talking about funding programs by career stage. So a lot of people, as you kind of move on, there's different grants that can support different points of your career, often starting with T or F mechanisms, going into K mechanisms, and then being an independent established investigator with an R01. So we'll talk about kind of this progression through NIH funding programs to support your career. There's specific instructions for applying for each of these things. There's very comprehensive and lengthy guides available online. So I provided the link and just an example here where under K Career Development Awards, if you scroll over to the PDF for the appropriate dates, you'll get this nice, I think 60, 70 some page pamphlet that has all the instructions you need. Before we get into our Q&A, just a quick comment on early stage investigator status. So the goal of this was how do we use grants from the NIH to support early career? And a lot of people's goal would be to be an established investigator with an independent R01 and their own independent lab. First time around, we all get a little bonus of early stage investigator status where the pay lines are different for established investigators versus early stage investigators. Until you've had an R01 or a substantial independent award, we all have early stage investigator status as long as you're within 10 years of your terminal degree. The infographic to me is a little confusing because it's double negative, so I'll lose ESI status if I, as opposed to just who has it. But there's more information on the NIH website, the link's there, but it's an important tool that many people use to kind of launch their independent career. So without further ado, we'll stop there and I'll unshare so that we can get everybody on the screen here. And I'd like to invite our speakers today to kick us off by just kind of briefly introducing yourself and then telling us a little bit about how you used or leveraged NIH grant funding mechanisms to get to where you are now. So. Dr. Barnes unmuted first.
Yeah, I was thinking alphabetical order, but we'll do that. Perfect. So yes, I'm Jarrod Barnes. As Joe said, I am at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. I got my start. I'm a PhD. Just full disclosure, PhD, studied glycobiology at University of Georgia, and then moved to Cleveland Clinic, where I kind of had this, itch, if you will, for trying to write a grant, getting something done. So as soon as I moved to Cleveland Clinic, I started writing almost as I was touching down and unloading my personal stuff into my apartment. I was also writing grants at the same time in the lab and got an F-32 submitted in about 6 months. Got it funded in the first year. And then it was kind of off to the races at that point in terms of writing, because really what happens is funding in my mind begets more funding. So I got that F-32 early and then started focusing on a K because as you know, even if you don't know, in a K-99, you have a limited time. So about 4 years after you receive your degree, you have to start working on that. So I got the K99 a few years later, and then started my next thought of where am I going to move, how am I going to transition this. So started with an F for me, moved to a K99 ROO, and then once I got a couple of positions in mind, in terms of where I wanted to go, to be recruited and look for faculty positions, I ended up here at UAB, and then wrote an RO1 on a completely different topic and still had my ROO K99 at the same time. So if you do it right, you can actually leverage that for more funding and get different funding on top of having your K. So at one time I had the two R's, and was moving those quite along. So that was my trajectory. Everybody's is different. I actually did more than just submit to an F. I did more than just submit to a K. I submitted to American Heart. They didn't like it, but it seemed that the NIH did. So you just have to keep trying, and that's my advice.
Okay, maybe I'll go next. I think that's going to be a theme today, is to just keep trying, and I think we're all going to probably echo that because that's sort of the process. I'll tell you a little bit about my story. So my name is Rachel Knipe. I'm a MD by training, and did a pulmonary critical care fellowship here in Boston at the combined Harvard program. And actually, my first grant was actually an ATS grant. So I should mention that the ATS has really nice sort of like bridge funding for early career professionals, and it gives you a little bit of money to kind of get started. So that was sort of my first grant. It was like a 2-year small amount of money to get some preliminary data. And I ended up applying for and getting a K08 award, which is for physicians, scientists, with more of a basic and translational project. And so my project involved a lot of animal modeling and cell culture work, and not really human subjects research. So that's why I applied for the K08 mechanism. I did not get it on my first try. So I'll get back to this theme of like applying and applying again. So it took 2 tries, and my second time it got funded. And I think the K08 and the K23 are both like part of this really important mechanism, which is like a career development award. And as Jarrod alluded to, and I was going to also mention, is that there are other career development awards, including one through the American Heart Association. So if any of your work is like relevant to like vascular biology, endothelial biology, that's a really nice multi-year, 4 or 5-year grant as well. So the K08 provided me with salary support for 5 years, which was really helpful to have protected time from clinical work in order to pay my salary and allow me to spend time in the lab getting data. It doesn't have a lot of extra money, and so for experiments and stuff. And so it is really important that during the K time that you have a mentor that can help to pay for some of the science that you're doing so that you can complete all the work on your K. Especially it was important for me having a lot of animal work on my K, is that I had support from my institution, my mentor, to pay for some of that stuff. But one of the reasons I mentioned that is that in my last 2 years of my K08, I applied for and got an RO3 award, which is sort of like almost a supplement to the K. It was like $50,000 a year for 2 years. And I wrote it in a little bit more of an exploratory way than my K08, which was very hypothesis driven, in order to allow me to do some longer models in order to generate some preliminary data to work towards an RO1. And so it's sort of a bridge funding mechanism that was very helpful for me because it allowed me to have some dedicated money to pay for experiments that I was doing to sort of spin off into an RO1. And so I overlapped the K08 and the RO3, and then towards the end of probably in the 3rd or 4th year of my K08, started applying for RO1s. And the other point I wanted to highlight that Joe made is that it is really important to pay attention to your ESI timeline. So your ESI, your early stage investigator status, is active for 10 years after you finish training. And during that time, when you apply for your RO1, and you have to be like the main PI, it can't be a multi-PI grant. So that's another point for your first R1, is that you get for the NHLBI, when I was going through, and I think this is still true, you get 10 points added to your score. So if the funding line is 14%, you can score up to a 24% to get funded, which is a huge benefit for your first R1. So it is really important not to miss that ESI deadline. So that was helpful for me. And I got my first R1 through the NHLBI, and I'm on that now. And so that was kind of my path, and those were the highlights I wanted to start off with.
I think I'm up next. So I'm Hasina Outtz Reed. I'm assistant professor here at Weill Cornell. So I guess my first NIH funded grant was a F grant when I was an MD PhD student up at Columbia. So I applied for the F31 mechanism while I was in the PhD years of my MSTP program. And then went on to Penn, where I did my residency and fellowship, and applied for my K sort of fairly early, sort of in the fellowship years when I had gone back to the lab for research. And so that's just a pointed way of saying, again, the repeated theme where, I had some great mentorship very early in my career that, which I tell myself daily and the people in my lab daily, is that you cannot get grants that you do not write. So if you do not put in the grants, you cannot actually get the grant. It seems trite, but it's like you just can't. Like if you don't have shots on goal, you actually will not be able to get any of those things. And if you have a reasonable idea, there really is very little harm in going ahead and going for it. And I still to this day learn something from every grant that I put in, and every grant that I put in, which are, most of the time, the nature of the business is that they're unfunded. I get something out of those every single time, and the science gets better. So, I was on my K as a fellow and used that. And when I was on the market for faculty positions, I actually also got a K equivalent grant from a foundation. So I actually had both of those grants simultaneously when I was on the markets for a job, and then started my lab in 2019, basically before my K had actually started. So I moved it with me, and the money had not actually hit Penn before I landed here at Weill Cornell. Just another quick note on the K is that, I submitted that first K very early, and so it got sort of a score that was on the bubble. And so didn't necessarily look like it was going to be funded. It was definitely like right at the pay line where it could sort of be pulled across the finish line by the PO. Not wasting any time, I just put in another K in the next cycle, but actually the first one that I had submitted was the one that ended up being funded. So, it's just one of those things where you just never know. And it's, again, you just try to put yourself in the best position. So again, it was that first one technically that got funded, although I had already submitted a revised one by that time. So then, at Weill Cornell, started my lab in 2019, which was a horrible time to start a lab because then COVID happened like right after I had started it. But that notwithstanding, I applied for, just scraped my way to some data and getting the lab going, and used that to submit an R01 application, I guess, when I was still in the third year of my K. And really, I almost used it as I kind of knew that my work in my lab needed to pivot in some ways. And I almost wanted to know what my study section thought about it, essentially. So I wrote, and they didn't like it. And that was useful because I didn't get that R01, and I immediately put in another one directly sort of addressing the concerns that they had, and then was funded on the second cycle for my R01. And so, I ended up overlapping on my K and my R01 for a year and a half because I had submitted that first R01 so early that then I put the second, the revised one back in pretty soon after. And then, in similar fashion, have since applied for a second R01, even, though I'm sort of in the middle of this first one, just knowing that it takes so long to get these things, even before the current situation, that you kind of just have to keep moving forward. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. Thank you all for, like I said, it sounds like we have a couple different pathways and a couple different mechanisms that we can easily cover with our collective expertise here today. So, as mentioned, I kind of wanted to start at the beginning, talk about kind of opportunities for people during residency, training, postdoc time, and talk about F&T grants. So, Dr. Outtz Reed had mentioned kind of shots on goal and one of those ideas, and Dr. Barnes had mentioned that grants beget other grants. So I was just asking, what's kind of the role of the F mechanisms in your mind as far as your first individual grant. I think a lot of us probably didn't know how most of this works at that time, but, kind of wrote a grant anyway to kind of get things going. So what was kind of the role of the F-32, and how do you think that that helped you in your early career?
Yeah, I'll start that. So I didn't. That's a great question. I didn't know what an F-32 was. For the most part, I did not know what that was. I had to kind of look around to see what was available. It's kind of in a way, I guess, a little lame here that I actually got found an NIH guide to writing a grant. It was a book. It was a spiral bound book that happened to be laying around at Cleveland Clinic, collecting dust. And that's kind of where I started and used that to write my first grant. I knew if I got, typically with these grants, they're about 6 pages. And I knew that I could only put probably 4 or 5 pieces of data into that grant. So I generated really good key pieces of data I thought would be useful and then wrote around that. And I think one of the biggest key points, and I think it was kind of mentioned as well, but I want to also kind of hammer in on that, is that you really need a mentor that, and hopefully you guys all are here and have great mentors, but you really need a mentor that's super supportive of you writing a grant, because sometimes you'll hear, hey, you don't need to write a grant. We've got funding here. We just need you to work. That's not in your best interest all the time. It kind of goes both ways. I think me working on a grant is also going to benefit someone else, especially if I'm covering my own salary. So I think one of the main things is having that good support. I actually got to see how the whole grant application came together, but I also noticed in it that, hey, my grant research strategy was only a portion of it, only about 20%. If you think of the institute, the environment, the teaching or the mentoring mechanism, all those things combined, it was just a portion of it. And really I got to see how all that would come together. And I got to see, okay, this guy, this my mentor, what's his contribution going to be to my career? And you get to kind of see it unfold on paper. So all of that was kind of really useful for me. And I still use some of the same concepts today when I help my students write for their grants.
Speaking specifically about the that was the first grant I ever wrote. I had no idea what I was doing, and I basically was informed by my mentor that I would be writing an F grant. So I was like, okay, I guess I'm doing this. But I think, and his point, which was accurate, is that if you want to be an independent investigator, that's the job, right? So you might as well get started thinking about how you can be just continuously thinking about how to convey the science that you want to do and convincing other people that it's worthwhile. So I think, even going back to that early grant, like I said, every grant I've ever written has helped me in some way. And I think even going back to that one, because it was the first one I wrote, I think it's also important to recognize the training and career development grants, how much, as Jerry mentioned, the science isn't such a big part of it. I mean, obviously is a big part, but there's so many other parts that are important in terms of the mentorship and the career development. So it sort of got me used to thinking about that aspect in particular too, about some of these earlier trainee grants. And I think just to piggyback on the point about, there will be differences of opinion about when, how many grants to write. I similarly have had parallel tracks where I have really aggressive mentors that are like, you should be writing grants, just keep writing grants, put them in early when you have a good idea. And then others say, oh, just wait, you're not ready, just do it. I've basically never listened to any of the advice that says to not put in a grant, actually ever, that says to not put in the grant. I've learned to just trust my internal decision-making about when I think an idea is ready, even if I don't think it's going to be funded the first time. You want to just be able to get, just putting it on paper. It helps me clarify exactly the science, saying, wait, what is my hypothesis again? Or like, that's actually a terrible idea, I should do it this way. It really, really, really is helpful. So I think even those early training grants were helpful to that end.
I totally agree with everything's been said. I will say I was one of those people that got that advice, oh, you don't need to write an F. I'm maybe coming as an MD, you need to spend more time in the lab. You're not ready. You're on the T32. We can pay for you, that kind of stuff. So that was some of the early messaging that I got was probably not the best advice because I needed to learn how to write grants, and so when I was writing my K, that was like my first big grant. And, like I said, I did it twice. So maybe my first one would have been a little stronger if I'd had more grant writing experience. But I mean, since then I've learned a lot about writing grants and gotten better at it. But I do think that the more that you write, the better you get, and the more you write, the more feedback you get. I totally agree with Hasina about that. Shots on goal and learning something from every grant and honing your science and your ideas. It's all really part of the process. And so I now advise people for sure to write for the Fs early and to get that experience and to get feedback, and put your ideas together, and think about what you want to do, and then you can see how it floats past the study section and get feedback and rewrite. So I definitely think the F is a great training grant, a great way to learn how to write grants, and a good preparation for writing a K or a career development award, of like we talked about, either from a foundation, a heart association, or the NIH.
So to follow up what Dr. Knipe just mentioned, I think I have a question here is, for earlier career, do you see any advantage and disadvantage between the three mechanisms, which is F, T32 versus an institutional K12?
I can jump on that then.
Sure.
So to me, I think a T32 is great. It's just not as involved in terms of putting in an application. Now, you put in a couple of pages, maybe a page. It's more about maybe a personal statement. In some ways, you may even get up and give a chalk talk about it. So you don't really do that the same way with the F. So if I were, potentially to rank them, a T32, then a K12, and then the F. But they're all, I mean, even though it's a K award, the K are mostly internal as well, those K12s are. So, but they still give you money, and any money is good money if you're trying to get protected time. And you get an opportunity, anytime you have an opportunity to really sit down and plan your research, your idea on paper, is super helpful. So they're all really important mechanisms. I just think anytime you're able to write for an external funding mechanism, there's just a little bit something different about it, because they don't know you at the NIH. They don't know your face. So you really have to convince them with your words. And I think that's the biggest thing.
I think that's a great suggestion. I think the take home message is you have to write, whether it's an F, whether it's a K, or how many attempts of R that you tried, write and get feedback from either a study session or mentor, and then keep improving your research and improving your grant writing skills. So moving on, transitioning from F or pre-K, I think the question moving on is K. During the K period, I think some of us got different advices from different mentoring or other people. Should you just kind of hone in and trying to push for the R, put your 100% effort to write your R, or you should every year try a 1 or 2 year foundation award or try a 2-year R3? Or do you think the smaller grant eventually will help the R1?
I think all of it, right? These things are not mutually exclusive. I think there's a lot of value in applying for a K award, and so I'm just speaking from the I don't think, and I think that is actually helping you focus on the eventual R, right? Because a lot of that is writing what your transition to independence would be, and sort of helping you think about how exactly will I pull this off and becoming an independent investigator. That said, some of the advice that I give for some of the smaller grants is that, as you're working towards those bigger grants, applying for the smaller ones is working towards the bigger ones. Sometimes I do like let me try out some aims with this small foundation grant, and you just like give it a whirl of thinking about a particular concept. Maybe that's completely different than the direction your lab has been, or maybe is where you're working towards, but using those smaller grants and those smaller mechanisms as a way to help yourself get practice about those particular aims. And so, what's the worst that can happen? You don't get it, or you do actually as a builder to, the bigger grants that you get. So I think it's all good, because again, if you can do it, which I think, you should, and if, the advice that, oh, you should be focusing on getting the science done, etc. I mean, that is also true. And the job is that you need to get the science done and also be able to have productivity on the grants. And it's actually important to learn to be able to do that efficiently, I think. And so I know that I used to take me a painful amount of time to write every grant, and not saying that I'm, great at it now, but I definitely can whip those things out way faster than I used to be able to do. And that's just because at this point I've done so many. So
One point that made me think of, I wanted to mention, was that it can be really helpful to look at other people's grants. And it can be really helpful if there are people at your institution who are especially like a year or two ahead of you, who are in a sort of similar area. A lot of people are willing to let you read their grant and just see how you formatted stuff, and see how they wrote things, how they presented stuff. And that can be really helpful. And I think and like on the other side, having people read your grant before it goes off to study section is really invaluable. So a lot of places have either like an internal K or R, like a mock study section, or if they don't, your mentor or friends or colleagues may have people they can suggest who are willing to read them and give you advice. Because I've found that really helpful, is that your first draft is definitely going to be not your best. And you want it to go through a couple of rounds of edits, ideally, before it gets submitted. And the more that happens before you submit it, the less it can happen like at study section, right? So I would encourage you to both look at other people's grants to get a sense of how they write and how they present stuff. And then also have show your grant, even if you feel like it might not be ready. That's the time to show it to other people, ask them to read it, and see how it comes across, because that can be really valuable. And a lot of places people do that as an exchange. You read their grant and they read your grant, and then that's kind of a mutually beneficial process. The other point I wanted to make about applying for Ks is that the K is really a career development grant, and so the parts about career development are almost as important as the science. And so I want to make sure that I just make the point that you take a lot of time to think about your career development. So who's going to be on your training committee? There's a group of faculty that are you identify to mentor you through the K period, and you're going to get letters from them. It's important to think about how they will mentor you on each aspect of the science that you're doing, and then how your project is going to train you. So what are the things you're going to learn as part of the K or the career development period that are going to help you get to independence? And then how is your project on a path to independence? So those are things that the review panel, the study section is going to be looking for in the application, just as much as they're looking for, like, did you have the right controls for your experiments? And did you think about the alternative, strategies for this experiment? So it's sort of equally weighted. So it's really important to spend as much time on that as on the science. And that when you get to the R01 level, it's really more about the science and the preliminary data and your, how that all holds together. But at the career development or the K level, it's really important, the career development parts.
So during the intro, we hit on a little bit of a theme where everyone kind of talked about getting grants in early and often. but there's different advice that people give as far as when are you ready for a K. So what do you think is kind of the minimum bar, or the you know, one publication, 5 publications, or any of that you think you need before you go in for a K?
I feel like this is not controversial. There's just so many people strongly held opinions about this. So that's probably a way of saying that there's a lot of strongly held opinions about this. So I'm not sure. And for every one story about it has to be this way or it won't get funded, there's another story on the other side. I think the context can be important if there's sort of because it's a career development award, you sort of have to indicate that you have a path towards that and are prepared for what that entails. So sometimes I think the amount of sort of papers or background you have can be a little bit tailored because you're kind of just trying to show the study section you're going to be able to do the things you're proposing. At the same time, part of what you're proposing is to learn to do the things that are in the proposal. So I think it's a mistake to think you need to be saying, I already know how to do all of this. I already have all of these data, as you can see. I mean, that's kind of the point of the training grant, right? Like, so in an RO1, it's like, yeah, you need to know that you know how to do this. But the point of a training grant is like, I'm going to learn how to do this. So I think that, people, and I won't actually opine on papers versus no papers. It's more, do you have a great set, a good hypothesis based on some amount of feasibility and data that is cohesive and sound, and that may or may not have resulted in publications up until that point. And it's because I've seen it happen so many different ways. So that's just my 2 cents.
Dr. Barnes?
Yeah, I think I echo what Dr. Outtz Reed said. I don't know if it really matters in some cases, but if you do have a good publication, like you have a high impact published article, I think it really helps as well. I know I did going in. I think it really did help me to get a K. But more than that, I actually had a really good career development plan. I remember some of the comments where someone put, I don't know why they thought it was a pleasure to read, but they did actually put it was a pleasure to read the career development plan. I don't know if I would have ever put that on one of those, but I thought it was interesting that they said that. So that career part was really, we took time on it. I think that really helped. And with some of the training parts, again, Dr. Outtz Reed made a really good point about it's not what you know, but what you can say you're wanting to learn, especially for feasibility. A lot of these grants, you say, I don't have this, but I'm wanting to learn it. And so in some cases I put, going to do a postdoc. I think my phrase that I used was postdoc in a month. I came up with this clever thing. I'm going to do a postdoc in a month at this lab. I'm going to do a postdoc in a month at this lab. And I had some training sessions that were built in that way. I think those things really caught more than, the actual paper element, but I think a manuscript does help.
Yeah, I would echo that too. I mean, I think there is debate about like whether whether you need a paper, how many papers you need, like how much you need to have done before going in. I will say, as an MD coming through, I think it was helpful for me to have a paper because I didn't do a PhD, so I didn't have papers from my PhD. I think if you've done a PhD and you have papers from that time, like that is more than enough to show that you are capable of like finishing a project and publishing it. And it doesn't necessarily have to be on the exact topic that you're putting your K in on. That's my opinion, but that's kind of been my sense that I've gotten, with maybe a little bit more pressure on the MDs to have at least something published, just to kind of show that you can complete a project and publish a paper. I think that helped me in my application. But it's sort of variable, but I think some evidence that you can do the work is really helpful. And then, as we've all said, a really strong training plan. Like if you're proposing to do single cell, you want to pull a mentor that really is in that area that can like teach you how to do that. Or if you're proposing to do animal modeling, you want to pull a mentor that does a lot of that in their lab, and include them. And so that you've really been thoughtful about each of the aim, but each of the training components of the grant, that you're going to have someone that is a go-to to train you in that area. And that will, those sort of, all of those will build together to make you into an independent investigator, so that when you put in your R1, you're trained in those things.
I think
So-
also I'd just like to emphasize how much part of the training component that I think is really important is the path to independence portion. So it's not just like you're learning to do these things so you can be part two of your mentor or mentors. It's saying these will then equip me to break off entirely into new territory that hasn't been done before. And I think that can go a long way in terms of the type of preliminary data or papers you present. Like if you're establishing a whole new field or section of a field and you're showing that everything you're doing is in service of, then you're going to land at the end of that 5 years and be the person who knows how to do fill in the blank. I think that goes a long way as well.
Yeah,
And there's a lot of examples of people who've applied with a mentor that's on the junior side, and hasn't mentored a K before, and it can really be helpful to have a co-mentorship situation in that case with a senior mentor, that provides additional, like more senior membership in terms of even mentoring, like the junior mentor on how to mentor a K awardee. And that can just add a little bit of additional expertise, whereas the junior mentor may be providing more of the day-to-day mentorship and stuff. So that can help bolster an application as well.
We had a question on the reapplication process. So someone in the chat had mentioned that, just asking about how you guys navigated revisions. So not everyone gets it on the first try, and you get some comments back. And then the specific situation they had mentioned was they submitted twice, got the same score each time. So how do you handle kind of responding to reviewers versus preparing a new submission, and how might you weigh those things?
I can start by speaking to the revisions. So I did, as Joe recommended in his talk, I talked to the PO after I got my summary statement back and got comments, and talked to the PO about the discussion and their thoughts and where advice that they had on like where to change. And in my case, I had put in 3 aims, and the third aim was kind of an attempt at a human correlation aim, but it fell a little flat. And it was a little vague and exploratory. And so their advice was actually just to drop it and to kind of go in with 2 strong aims, and to sort of build out those 2 aims. And so it was really helpful, and that's what I did. And I think it helped make a stronger grant. So I think the PO was really helpful in my case. And I also had got internal people to read it internally and kind of give me some advice on revisions. And that's how I handled that part.
I think one thing is that you mentioned, Rachel, at the end is to seek both, definitely speaking to the PO, because there's some color about the discussion, right? That hopefully really helps actually. But then in addition, as a supplement, with mentors who have been on study sections, who have written written summary statements, to get their read on what they're telling you to do, because now having been on study sections, there's really a difference that I wouldn't have appreciated before about there really are most of the time trying to help you, especially at the K stage, give them something that they would be excited about funding, but it can be sometimes difficult to understand exactly how to rework their feedback into a revised submission. And I think really taking the comments seriously and saying, okay, then, if this is not what's being valued about this, how do I address this, instead of just trying to sort of repackage something to the same thing? No, like really, I think take it seriously and change the grant. They're telling you what they want you to do to fund it. For me, it's like, okay, you tell me what you want me to do. I can do that. You know what I mean? So you just take it seriously.
That's what happened to me. I was like, okay, this no matter how I word this third aim, it's like no one likes it. So I'm just gonna take it out
Yeah.
and get the money. Yeah. And then figure out whether I want to do it later.
No, literally, it's like, tell me what you want me to do, and I will say that, and then like that's what we will do. I mean, people are telling you what they want to fund, so take it seriously.
I do think your point is also a good one about the study section. I think in general, especially the K section they want to help. And I think they want to advocate for people to have like a good training environment. And so some of that may be like subtly saying like, you need additional mentorship in this area, or like, don't focus too much on this. It might, distract you or something like that. So there may be, like you said, some hidden meetings in there trying to be helpful.
Yeah, good points. I think the person that submitted the question, they said they got a score and got the same score on the resubmission. Is that what I heard, Joe? Yeah, that sucks. I mean, anytime you get like the same score or even worse, a lower score, or sorry, a higher score, I guess, in this case, where it gets worse, that sucks. It's kind of demoralizing in a way. But I think what you have to do is really, again, just keep trying. But as everybody has said, if you can talk to the PO, a lot of times it used to be they were in the room, so they kind of got a feel in the room. Now being potentially on Zoom as well, you can kind of get they kind of have a feel of how your grant was talked about, or they at least should. And if it was on the cusp, then they should be able to kind of give you some direction. And sometimes it's even more valuable than what's written on the paper, because they can kind of express to you exactly what you should focus on. And at least lets them know too, by talking to them, that, hey, I'm really, wanting to get this thing funded. So if you had the resubmission and you can no longer submit for that same one, you have to change it up. You just need to change it up a little bit, slap a new title on it, change it up a little bit, make some of the notes and send it again, or try something a little bit different in terms of the strategy. The main point is that you have to kind of just look at what was said and take item line by line really, and pick out the salient points and just keep trying.
And I just want to say, I wouldn't be afraid of a hard change. Sometimes it's going to look different than you thought it's going to be, and that's okay. And I think probably it's more risky to keep trying to hammer down what you think it should be. Sometimes it's going to be that, I mean, in both cases for my K and my R, my resubmission looked a lot different than the first one, right? And the scores improved dramatically accordingly, and they looked way different on the second round, and that's okay.
Are we at the question answer time? I'm so sorry. I was really late.
Yes, we are.
Yes.
Okay. I have a question, and maybe you've already addressed this, but as far as a resubmission, if they didn't necessarily comment on something, is it best to just leave it alone and really only change the things that they commented on? Because sometimes when you're like kind of revising it, you may not want to just change everything, right? If they didn't comment on that.
I mean, that's tough. I think it depends on the flavor of the flavor of the context of how much they like the overall theme. But I agree. It gets, you go line by line, quite literally, on their comments. So if it wasn't addressed in that, then it probably, at least by any of the three, then probably it's okay, right? So I wouldn't go trying to reinvent the wheel entirely if it's not something that was flagged as a big issue. I don't know what the rest of you guys think.
Yeah, I was always advised not to change things that were not commented on, just because then it gives they might have liked it but not said anything. But then if you change it, it might introduce the possibility for a new criticism. So unless there's some good reason to, I was always advised not just to address the comments.
I think there are keywords you can look for when you get your summary statement. Did they say your aims are interdependent or contingent on each other? If they make some comments that seem like, wow, it doesn't seem like that's as bad as they are saying here. Sometimes you can read between the lines a little bit. They may have just not liked the grant whatsoever. That goes back to Dr. Outtz Reed's comments on sometimes you just have to do a hard rewrite and revision. And people that are more senior and have been on study sections, they're very valuable in that case because they can help read it. They can take a summary statement and help you decipher exactly what it's meaning. I mean, it's amazing how some of these folks are really good at it. They can tell you they hated it. They hated the whole thing. And I'm like, what? They didn't say that, but they know. So I've actually had people tell me they did not like this, and I did not get that from the summary statement.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Other things that I think people kind of look for in K applications is, and we've touched on this a little bit, is enough independence from the mentor so that it's not like exactly the same as the mentor, but is within the area that the mentor still can mentor you in. And so that's like that line that you want to keep an eye on. And then also I've heard that people really look for alliance between the mentor's letter and your candidate section, so that making sure that you are reading each other's papers and that the mentor is involved in sort of helping and crafting the career development award. So making sure that what you say in your career development is echoed and aligns with what's said in the mentor's letter.
So I'll ask, kind of moving forward along the path, as you're thinking about R01, what makes you decide R01, R21, R03? Like what kind of goes into those thoughts as far as which mechanism may be appropriate to be the next one?
I think, you'll get lots of different advice on this. And, again, sitting on study section, it's a lot of work to write these things, no matter what. So it starts to be sometimes diminishing returns, thinking you're going to do better with an R21 and not have to necessarily have this robust preliminary data. It doesn't seem to pay off. It's hard. It kind of feels like you should just go for it no matter what. Unless actually you're pivoting hard to something where it's like, this is very exploratory, I have nothing. But if you actually have somewhat of a basis, I think it's just my personality. I think you just go for it. And it really does become diminishing because I do not actually think it is necessarily easier. I think actually the data bear this out. It's not easier to get an R21. So you might as well just go for it. I think the R03 though is different. And I think maybe I'll let Rachel opine on that.
Yeah, I think the R03, I think the numbers are that it is a little easier to get an R03. I mean, it's not a ton of money, but it's the percentage wise, it's a little easier to get than an R01. And I think is a nice bridge funding. Also, a lot of places have a similar sort of 2-year internal bridge funding, which I would definitely look out for at your institution and see if you can apply for, because that K to R period is known to be sort of a vulnerable period, and a lot of places do try to help support that time period. I had the same thought about the R21, R01. It is tempting to think like an R21. It's a 2-year grant for the most part, with a chunk of money that you can think of as being like bridge funding. But the problem is it's a ton of work to write. I think that it can be like as hard to get as an R01, and I believe that you still lose your ESI if you get it, and so you're potentially like giving that up for a 2-year grant, where instead of going for the full 4 or 5-year grant, which is you could use your ESI for it in a little bit more beneficial way. So I went straight for the R01 too. Now I'm putting in R21 with the new ideas. I think they're great for after. And I also think multi-PI grants are also great for after your first R1, because it's great to write with people and to do collaborations, really fun part of science. But the first one, I think, is really good to use your ESI on a full R1.
For an R03, do you have to have a prior funding, prior like R level or a K or is it just it's standalone grant?
That is an excellent question. I think you have to have at least a K, but I'm not 100% sure on that. I'm not exactly sure, but I think you have to have prior funding. It doesn't have to be our level, but I think maybe.
think it's IC dependent. So if you want to apply for R3 through HLBI, you have to have a K grant. Some of the IC does have a standalone R3 funding mechanism that is not tied to K.
Yeah, thanks.
Right. We've eclipsed the top of the hour here, so I think we'll call it good. Thanks again to our faculty participants for sharing their stories and knowledge with us. This was great. I know I certainly learned a lot. We recorded this, and then we also have the slides that'll be distributed to everyone afterwards. Stay tuned for our 3rd and 4th sessions, which are coming up last Thursday of the month in March and April. And finally, any further questions, feel free to reach out to any of us from the ECP working group. And also remember, your POs are here to help you and are looking to talk about NIH grants. So thanks again. And thanks to our faculty. Appreciate you guys.
Thank
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.